Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on the rise of Jim Crow. In this conversation, we're going to look at the ideology of white supremacy, the kind of thinking of the era that was prevalent in public opinion and in the academic community, and we're going to try to understand the pieces of that. We're going to look at disfranchisement, or the taking away of the right to vote of Black Americans, and we're going to look at segregation, the legal foundation of it, the creation of two separate and unequal societies, the violence and intimidation that was used to enforce segregation, the inequities that came as a result of it, and how one black leader, Booker T. Washington, responded to the Jim Crow era. So the name Jim Crow ultimately becomes a way to refer to an entire era of American history from the late 1800s through the first half of the 1900s. And the name itself comes from the comedy of Thomas Dartmouth Rice, who's pictured here, who lived from 1808 to 1860. And he was a minstrel show performer, and he had his own show. And he developed a character that he called Jim Crow, and that character is pictured here. This character was a character in which Rice, a white man, would put black makeup on his face, what we call blackface. He would accentuate some physical features. He would wear the clothing that you see, and he would act in the most stereotypical manner that could be imagined in a disparaging manner towards black people. And is a widely popular show. It is popular in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Now he passes away, but other people are going to take up the mantle and do this similar thing. Minstrel shows and blackface are popular all the way through probably about half of the 1900s. And so it is from this character, and I think it's very interesting that the laws of this period become known as Jim Crow laws. And I think that's an important starting point for us to understand that this character that Rice created, which was the most disparaging, demeaning way to view Black people, is the core of what our legal system essentially ended up thinking and doing in this particular era. So in the Jim Crow era, the reality is, and this is true all the way until the 1950s, when we start to see some movement away from this. The three things that were done in the Reconstruction era, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. It gave slaves freedom. 14th Amendment said that Black Americans have citizenship and civil rights. The 15th Amendment said we guarantee your right to vote. But in reality, what is going to happen, and one of the things that's really important for us to understand so that we can make informed decisions about racial inequality and the history of it and how to move forward, is that freedom ended up equaling sharecropping. We've already seen that. Citizenship and civil rights ended up in equaling segregation or two unequal societies. And voting rights ultimately ended up equaling disfranchisement, the taking away of the right to vote. This is what these things ended up meaning in reality. So a lot of people are confused and they think, well, we granted freedom, citizenship, civil rights, and voting rights back in the 1860s. And so why are we talking about racial issues? The reason we're talking about racial issues today is because for a full century and more, we did sharecropping, segregation, disfranchisement as our answer to these things. We did not do the things that we had promised. Instead, we replaced them with something that was unequal, unjust, unfair. Where was the federal government in all of this? Well, the federal government allowed the white South to nullify the 14th and 15th Amendments. Freedom ended up actually occurring, but the 14th and 15th Amendment uh, actually more or less gets nullified by white Southerners. And ultimately, the reality is that in that process, the Southern way became the American way. There are a number of pieces here that get put together into the puzzle of what it means to be an American that come out of choices made by Southerners in this period and the choice by the federal government to walk away. We saw the Compromise of 1877 and how the federal government said we're going to remove the troops. We get a president, we get a Republican president. Now here we are, and what we're going to see is the federal government walking back off of defending the 14th and 15th Amendments, allowing the South to move forward to nullify, again, not formally nullify, but in spirit, nullify those amendments. And then ultimately, the Southern way is going to become the American way. No more clearly is this seen than with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization formed in 1894 to care for the graves of Confederate soldiers. And so these people formed an organization to do work in cemeteries and care for and keep up the graves of Confederate veterans. They are lost cause thinking people. And they essentially, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, are going to implement a program where they're going to raise money to build monuments. We have two very famous monuments pictured here of Confederate monuments pictured here. That's become quite a conversation in our day, in the 2020s. They built these monuments, hundreds and hundreds of monuments throughout the South to Confederate veterans, and always, and not just in the South, but in the North as well. And on top of that, the United Daughters of the Confederacy are going to publish textbooks. And those textbooks are going to put forward the lost cause argument, the lost cause narrative. So that narrative of the lie that we've been looking at is going to be put forward in textbooks. And again, the Southern way is going to become the American way. I grew up in central Pennsylvania. Many of these things that are in these textbooks are believed firmly, even today in the 21st century, in central Pennsylvania about the Civil War. Monuments exist throughout the country to Southern Confederate leaders, and we're still trying to figure out what to do about that. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy, very important in this conversation, very emblematic of the thinking of the era. So as we transition to say, so we understand where the idea of what the name Jim Crow came from. We understand the reality of what the amendments ended up meaning that were passed after the Civil War. And we understand that the federal government is going to walk back its support of those amendments and its defense. But the ideology that all of this is going to be built on is what we call the ideology of white supremacy. And you might say, well, haven't white people believed this all along since the beginning of American history, since slavery? To a degree. But it is in this period, in the late 1800s, in which I think this is most clearly formalized, most clearly thought out and formalized in this period. So I want to ask the question for us to think about, what's the basis for the idea that one race is superior to another? What's the root of that kind of thinking? Where does that come from? Why would anybody, I mean, just think of it, because of somebody's physical characteristic, and that's race divides people by physical characteristic, and it says your skin color is one color, and that makes you different from somebody else. Well, we know people have different eye color, they have different hair color. There's some people who are tall and some people who are short. People are physically different from each other in so many ways. What is the basis of believing that because of a physical characteristic, one group of people is superior to another group of people? That's a very interesting question, and we're going to dig into that a little bit here. Carl Ellis, in his book, Free at Last, I think touches on one of the key issues that we have not discussed up to this point, and it's a critical issue. Ellis wrote, "The sexual exploitation of the slave woman caused a tangled net of trouble for everyone. The black man suspected the white man of having designs on his woman. The black man suspected the black woman because he was never sure that she could be all his, even if she wanted to be. The white woman suspected the black woman of being the object of her husband's exploitation, and the white man suspected the black man, fearing that his male slave might do to his white woman what he was doing to the slave woman." And so I think Ellis raises a really important question here, because underneath it all, there is this really, really problematic thing that occurred. This horrible thing that occurred in slavery, which was slave owners sexually exploiting their female slaves. And the result of that was a large number of children that were born of mixed race. But we know from that era that those mixed race children, their status was defined by their mother's status. So if the mother was a slave, the children were slaves. And that was kind of a protective device to allow that sexual exploitation to occur without creating a bunch of free people who were of mixed race. And that's something we have to come to terms with. This statement by Carl Ellis suggests that that choice went so deep in our psyche and in our thinking about race and race issues, and ultimately is going to, I think, really help to reveal to us what the greatest fear really is, why people felt it was necessary to define one race as superior to another. And I believe that greatest fear was that white people believed that their race ultimately would disappear, that their group was would ultimately be at risk of actually disappearing into oblivion as white and black, free and equal people mixed together to create mixed race children, offspring. And ultimately, there would be no white race left. This is a really important thing for us to stop and ponder and to consider as we start to think about what are those pieces of white supremacy that form that argument, and why was that argument formed in the first place. So white public opinion at this time, we're going to look at this on two levels. We're going to look at white public opinion, and then we're going to look at the academic view of it in this period. Generally, among white people in America, these things were believed to be true. The white race was naturally superior to the black race. That blacks were inferior and incapable of living side by side with white Americans in freedom equally. That therefore whites should rule over blacks. You see, this is a picture of a cartoon of the South Carolina legislature with black people in control. I told you before, the South Carolina legislature, black Americans gained control of that body for a period of time. And so this picture shows black people out of control, total chaos. And you see the white people are kind of in dismay because, again, they've lost control. The black people are in power, and this is creating a bad result. You should know that white public opinion with regard to white superiority did not just apply to the black race. This is a period of the Chinese Exclusion Act where we said we're not going to accept any more immigrants from China because of white supremacy. This is the period in which we are rounding up Native Americans and violating old treaties that we had signed with them and putting them on reservations and taking control of lands that had been promised to them. How could we do such a thing? How could we? Because we believed that they were inferior. So this applies to other races other than the black race, but it is most clearly, as far as our conversation, being applied here over the long term to the black race. So white public opinion, again, not just in the South, this is a commonly held idea. And so among American scholars, they're going to build on white public opinion, and they are going to develop essentially a three-part argument. And that three-part argument is going to ultimately uh, form into and be adopted into the American ideology. The first part of the racial argument is innate inferiority. The idea that, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past, but this is where this really becomes firmed up and becomes kind of the way generally people are looking at this. And that is to say that the black race is innately inferior to the white race. Innate means it's something that's attached to your person, it's part of who you are, and as a result of something genetic in you or something natural to the race, you're inferior to other races. Because you're inferior, one race is inferior to the other. And before I leave that, let me just say innate inferiority also suggests you can't change it. You can't change it through education or changing the environment. It's just the way people are. And so we accept the idea that this is natural, that the black race is innately inferior and the white race is innately superior. And then the second element of that is the idea of racial incompatibility. The idea, if it is true, and if number one is true, if one race is innately inferior to the other race, then it would also be true that the two races would be incompatible as far as living side by side, free and equally, because one race is superior to another. That's not going to work. There has to be some ability to control that situation. So the two races then are incompatible to each other because one race is superior to the other. And then thirdly, the third element of this, and this is what I was getting at with the Ellis quote, if that is all true, if one race is innately inferior to the other, and if the two races are therefore incompatible, then the third thing must be true, and that is that there needs to be racial purity. Then that puts an emphasis on the idea of racial purity. If the races mix together, it is going to be harmful to everyone in the view of white supremacy. The ideology of white supremacy says if you allow the races to mix together, you are going to get a bad result for everyone. You will drag down the white race. You will bring those inferior genes into the white race, and you will bring down that superior race to the level of everyone else. So these are the key components of the racial argument. Now let's see how this forms into the American ideology, because we talked at the beginning about the three parts of the American ideology: laissez-faire, survival of the fittest, and the gospel of wealth. Laissez-faire is part of our history dating back to the 1700s. That's already in place. This idea that that people should be free to pursue their economic interests without government interference. That idea is the idea of classical liberals in the 1700s. It's part of our American Revolution. It's part of why we resisted the British. That idea and the rugged individualism, self-reliance that comes along with that, independent living, all flows together. It's already existing. But that American ideology that we talked about early in our conversations, we were taking the big broad look, but we kind of did that backwards, because it is in the late 1800s that the other pieces of this American ideology are put into place. That's why we look at laissez-faire as kind of the core idea, because it's in the late 1800s that a guy named Herbert Spencer comes along, and he makes an argument for what he calls social Darwinism. And he says that just like natural selection occurs in evolution, as Darwin argued, he said there's this natural selection process going on in society. And he argued that the fittest in society survive, the fittest people, the fittest groups survive, and the unfit don't. That's what happens. That explains this natural process of survival of the fittest. And so the elements of that are, number one, innate characteristics determine success or failure. So you see the connection back to the racial argument and how these weave together. That it's things about who you are as you are born that are part of your own self that will determine your success or failure in life. And ultimately, the way that works out is that the strong or fit survive, or they rise to the top of society. And the weak and unfit, they don't survive. They fall to the bottom of society. And that's natural. That's the way things are. And that thirdly, helping the weak to survive, doing anything like getting the government involved or any sort of social action is only going to impede the progress of the bigger group. Now, here's where we get into the ideas of racial incompatibility and racial purity. If you're helping the weak or the unfit group to survive, you're going to slow progress down. If the races mix, progress will be slowed. It will impede progress because you will weaken the stronger race. You see the comparison here, the formulations here. And then lastly, the best evidence of fitness is accumulated wealth. This is money, making money. This is an American idea, is a sign of fitness. It's evidence that you are in the superior group and the wealth is being accumulated by white people. So you see how these two, that racial argument and the American ideology, are going to kind of seamlessly be working together. And then you have the last part also put into the American ideology in the late 1800s, and that's the gospel of wealth. It was believed by secular people and religious people, but a lot of religious people believed in this idea, and it was put forward by Russell Conwell, a pastor who preached a sermon called Acres of Diamonds, they say as many as 1,000 times, in which he argued that it is the duty of Christians, it is the gospel of wealth for Christians to work hard, create wealth, and then do good things with that wealth. That's the natural order of things. There's no excuse for being poor. According to Conwell, if you're poor, you're just not trying. Tell me that's not a part of the American ideology even today. And so these three aspects, laissez-faire, survival of the fittest, the gospel of wealth, of the American ideology, firmly put in place by the late 1800s and woven with the racial argument as well. So this ideology of white supremacy is going to then form the basis of what we call the Jim Crow era. And the Jim Crow era, as we said, sharecropping, already a piece of our conversation, is going to involve three things: sharecropping, disfranchisement, and segregation. So to talk about disfranchisement, I want to ask this question: why disfranchisement? Why take away the right to vote of a group of people? We have to understand that when you take away the right to vote of a group of people in a constitutional republic like we have, you are essentially identifying those people as not worthy of political participation. That has ramifications to it. Ultimately, you could create a very disgruntled, unhappy group of people that is like millions of people. Why would you do such a thing? Why would you take such a risk? Why identify a group and take away their right to vote? Why disfranchisement? Reverend Dr. Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., said this: racism is not dislike, bias, or ill will toward another race. It is the assertion of power to obstruct justice, progress, and equality. I think Dr. Bernice King brings up a very important point here. We often think it's just, oh, I don't like people, prejudice towards them. That's a simplistic view of racism. Racism is assertion of power to obstruct justice, progress, and equality. When you take somebody's right to vote away, you are obstructing justice. You are intentionally impeding the progress of a group of people. In a constitutional republic like ours, it is very difficult. It's almost impossible for a group of people to make progress in our society if they are not able to express their political viewpoint, if they are not able to have a political voice. In this society, where we solve problems by measuring what people think, when we take away the right to vote from a group of people, we are obstructing justice for them. We are impeding their progress and their opportunity to live equally with everyone else. So what we did, because in the late 1800s, blacks were voting in large numbers, they were holding office. That's the reality. The Reconstruction things that we put in place were working, and there were a large number of people voting. We know in South Carolina, Black Americans actually got control of the South Carolina legislature for a time. As Black Americans got more power in the South because of their growing political influence, both parties started, the Republicans and the Democrats were actually competing for the votes of Black Americans. That made them more influential. And here's the hardcore reality of the 1890s. By that decade, both political parties decide that it is essentially in the interest of white people to not allow Black people to be so powerful. So this actually becomes more important. Race becomes more important than political power. The white power over the Black power becomes more important than the Republican and Democrats vying for power. And so what's often called the Mississippi Plan of 1890, this idea of how to do this, how do you keep people from voting without violating that 15th Amendment that says you can't take someone's vote away for race, color, or previous condition of servitude? Well, here's how they did it. They said, we're going to have poll taxes. You got to pay a tax to vote. All right? Doesn't matter whether you're white or black, you got to pay a tax to vote. We're going to have literacy tests. White or black, you have to be able to read to vote. We're going to have good character tests. We're going to have white primaries where in the early part of the year where we choose candidates, only white people can choose the candidates. We'll let black people vote in the fall whenever we have the general election, but we're going to keep them from choosing candidates. Now, I want to go backwards because you're going to say, well, these all apply to white people. Lots of white people can't read. That's right. Lots of white people are of bad character. That's right. People maybe can't afford they're poor white people that can't afford a poll tax. That's right. So what you do is instead of writing the law to say we're not going to let black people vote, you write laws that you can then use to corrupt the system. And the system that applies the laws is what the problem is. It's not actually the law itself. It's not necessarily wrong to say you got to be able to read to vote or you have to pay a tax to vote. What's wrong to say is you can't vote because of your race. And so here's what happened. You come in and pay the poll tax and you're black. You have to pay it months ahead of time. No one tells you. The white person who takes your money doesn't tell you that you have to bring your receipt back in the fall to vote. You come back to vote, you don't have your receipt, you're not allowed to vote. Literacy tests. You can't read and you're white. They pass something called the understanding clause. You go into, you're a white person, you go in, you can't read the card. The person that's behind the desk, another white person, asks you some questions. They say, well, I think that this person can understand what's on this card. You're black? They say, no, you can't understand. The grandfather clause. You can't read, you can't vote if you can't read, but if your grandfather voted, we're going to make an exception and allow you to vote. Again, that doesn't specifically violate the wording of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It certainly violates the spirit of it. And in reality, this program applied in other parts of the South and in Mississippi was enormously successful. Louisiana, Between 1896 and 1900, in 4 years, black voting was reduced by 96% because of the Mississippi Plan. In Alabama, 3,500, by the turn of the century, 3,500 out of 300,000 qualified black voters were still voting. By the time we get into the 20th century, the black vote has been nearly eliminated in the South by these laws. Again, the laws themselves weren't so much the issue as the system that was put in place to manipulate these laws to the disadvantage of black voters. Another element of this whole conversation was the intimidation that often came along with attempts to vote or hold office. Probably the most striking example of this is the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. In Wilmington, North Carolina, it had been pretty normal for black citizens to be on the city council, to be influential in city government. That had been going on for some time. But in 1898, an election was held and blacks were voted in again by, again, largely the black community. And the white community decided that's not acceptable. And so they marched on City Hall. They forced at gunpoint the black elected officials to resign their positions. And then they went to white neighborhoods and burned down the neighborhood and massacred people. So this is a stark example of white Southerners saying, we will not accept black Southerners having political power. So that's disfranchisement. That's taking away the right to vote. That's going to be in place until the 1960s. The second element of this conversation, so we have sharecropping, disfranchisement, and segregation. So the third element, actually, of Jim Crow is segregation. So I asked the question, why segregation? Think about what segregation is. Segregation is separating people into two different societies on just about every level of human interaction and saying, we're going to have one group of people live here and one group of people live here, and we're going to avoid interaction with those groups as much as possible. Why do that? Why segregation? And you might say, well, we've already answered that question. Well, in the slave era, white and black races lived in very close proximity to each other. So this is new. This isn't old. This is new. Why separate people by race? Anne Braden, in her book, The Wall Between, described this choice like this. She said, forbidden parks, forbidden buildings, forbidden movies, forbidden restaurants, white folks' schools, white folks' places, white world, you are colored, you can't go there. You are colored, that's for white people. The endless chant, steady and unceasing, down the years of a Negro child's life. Watch out, be careful, watch what you say, watch where you go. A hemmed-in world, a wall around your life. I think it's very important what Braden is saying here, because this choice to put a wall between the races affects not just black Americans, it affects white Americans. This is an important decision. It is going to both uh, be a grave injustice to black Americans, but at the same time, it is going to serve to create an acceptance of wrong and unjust thinking among white Americans. This is not going to solve any racial problems. All this is going to do is deepen those problems by creating this wall of separation. So segregation itself has a legal foundation. And the legal foundation of it is found in what occurred in 1883 and 1892 on the Supreme Court. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 had said that at the kind of the high water mark of black equality. The CRA of 1875 outlawed discrimination in public accommodation, public transportation, and jury service. And ultimately, within 20 years, all of that's going to be wiped away. Uh, a certain element was wiped away by civil rights cases, a series of cases in 1883, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause did not apply to private businesses. So, in other words, if you are operating a private business, the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to you. You can discriminate because the 14th Amendment applies to state governments and the national government. It doesn't apply to private business. In the Plessy-Ferguson decision in 1892, that is broadened to include public enterprises as well. Homer Plessy was a black man who tried to board a train car that was for whites only. And he was denied and he sued. And in the court case, the Supreme Court in 1892 said separate rail cars is okay as long as they are equal. It's called the separate but equal doctrine. And so by 1892, both uh, privately and now publicly, so this is public transportation we're talking about, railroads, both privately and publicly, the Supreme Court has said the 14th Amendment does not apply to these situations, and that the public transportation services are fine as long as they're equal. And so basically, the Supreme Court says you can separate as long as it's equal, and then doesn't come into the South and make sure, the government doesn't check to make sure anything's equal. So what you have is separate and unequal. But the idea of the court and the position of the government of the United States is stated right here. And that's going to stand pretty much rock solid until the 1950s. So we're talking the next 60, 70 years. This is going to be the legal foundation of segregation. So in response, the South built a wall. They outlawed everything interracial. They segregated hospitals, schools, public accommodations, workplaces, recreation, churches, funeral homes, cemeteries, everything. White and colored signs went up everywhere. Alabama, and these are different in different places, Alabama forbid interracial checkers playing. Atlanta said had Bibles for black people to put their hand on to swear their oath, and white people, different Bibles for different races. Mississippi segregated their taxi cabs. Florida and North Carolina made sure white and black students never touched the same textbooks. And so you have this wall of separation in every area go up in the South. This wall of separation, this segregation, was enforced by violence and intimidation. You have a group of people, black Southerners, with no power to affect the laws whatsoever. They are vulnerable to assault and murder. They're not protected in the criminal justice system. We've already seen that conversation. There's between 1900 and 1915, and the next period we're going to look at, over 1,000 lynchings. These are oftentimes when people try to rise up and resist this system. There's a constant fear of violence. There's no resource to the police. There's no recourse to police or courts. I just want you to realize that the situation of black Americans is the local officials, the state officials, and the federal government of the United States is simply not there for you. There is no place in our legal system where you have recourse at this time in the midst of this, what we call the Jim Crow era. The result are extreme inequities. Educational funding, $10 for white students, on average, less than $3 per black students on average. Things like hospital beds. There was one hospital bed for every 139 white people, which is about right. There's one hospital bed for every 1,941 black people. Convict leasing is expanded. There's a picture of that. Chain gang practices, sharecropping that we've already talked about, inequities in property ownership, in the criminal justice system, in the education, in healthcare, in society, in general. Everywhere you look, we have created firmly a free and unequal society. Now, one of the probably the most influential black leader of the late 1800s and early 1900s was Booker T. Washington. Washington was a slave and became free and really became a powerful voice at the turn of the century. And what his message, like he looked at the situation in front of him, he looked at disfranchisement and segregation, and he developed a message, and that message was, this is what we're going to do. He encouraged Black Americans not to worry about the things that they were being denied, but to take advantage of the things that they had been granted. And so if white America is going to allow you to learn a trade and to live independently, then learn a trade and live independently. Get economic independence now. That was his entire focus. Uh, we can leave social and political equality for later. What matters right now is economic independence, the ability to live independently. So he wanted Black Americans to be able to live independently of everyone, white Americans and anybody else to live independently of any other person or group, uh, but within the system that white Americans had built, within the social system, within the political system. So his argument is uh, we don't need social and political equality right now. What we need is economic independence. We're going to see in the future that W.E.B. Du Bois, another black leader, is going to take a really strong position against Washington's idea. So in this conversation, The Rise of Jim Crow, we have looked at the ideology of white supremacy that underlined or undergirded this period. We've looked at disfranchisement. We looked at segregation, the legal foundation of it, the creation of these two societies, the violence and intimidation used to enforce that wall that was created, the inequities, and the position of Booker T. Washington. And so I just want to remind you that we are in a situation now in the late 1800s where, as a result of the rise of Jim Crow, those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have come to mean not freedom, not civil citizenship and civil rights, not voting rights, but instead sharecropping, segregation, and disfranchisement. Some takeaways from this conversation: American public opinion, scholars, and the federal government embraced an ideology of white supremacy that determined that because of the innate racial inferiority of blacks, whites must rule over blacks for the good of both races and society in general. 2. With government support, Jim Crow laws systematically denied black citizens the right to vote and created two separate societies divided by race and enforced by law. 3. Both black and white leaders accommodated the Jim Crow system, and certainly the church, this includes the church, accommodated the Jim Crow system. The white church in the South clearly was part of that, and the white church in the North, in large part, looked the other way as this system was being developed. Some questions to consider. What characteristics does the Bible say are innate to humans? 2. Is survival of the fittest ideology biblical? Why or why not? And 3. Describe when segregation is and is not the Christian thing to do. Is segregation ever the Christian thing to do? thanks for joining the conversation today. I hope you have a great day and God bless you.